passion and intensity of Caravaggio's paintings was mirrored by his violent and turbulent lifestyle. Despite countless run-ins with the law and being implicated in more than one murder, he still found it within himself to create a body of strikingly innovative work. Caravaggio pioneered the use of sharp contrasts in lighting to maximize dramatic effect, and reimagined religious figures by dressing them in modern clothes and by placing them in modern interiors. Working from life and without preparatory sketches, Caravaggio's pairing of naturalistic observation of his models, who were often beggars, criminals, and prostitutes, with the expressive use of chiaroscuro lighting, gave rise to a unique style that became widely imitated. Even though he only lived until the age of 38, Caravaggio had a profound influence on later art movements, most notably Baroque art and 19th century realism. The Crucifixion of St. Peter. This 1600 canvas was painted for the Cerasi chapel of Santa Maria del Popolo in Rome, which also contains the other Caravaggio work, The Conversion of St. Paul on the Road to Damascus, completed the following year. The Crucifixion of St. Peter depicts the martyrdom of St. Peter, who had asked for his cross to be inverted so as not to imitate Christ. Hence he is depicted upside down in the image. The large canvas portrays the Romans with their faces shielded, struggling to raise the cross of the elderly but muscular apostle. Peter is heavier than his aged body would suggest, and the lifting of his body and cross requires the efforts of 3 men, as if the crime they are committing already weighs heavily upon them. The 2 works by Caravaggio, as well as an altarpiece by Annibale Carracci, were commissioned in September 1600 by Monsignor Tiberio Serassi, who died shortly afterwards. Caravaggio's original versions of both paintings were rejected and they passed into the private collection of Cardinal Sanessio. Several modern scholars have since speculated that Sanessio may have taken advantage of Carassi's sudden death to seize the paintings at this time. The 2 saints, Peter and Paul, together represent the foundations of the Catholic Church. Peter the rock upon which Christ declared his church to be built, and Paul who founded the seat of the church in Rome. Caravaggio's paintings were therefore intended to symbolize Rome's, and by extension, Serassi's, devotion to the princes of the apostles in this church, which dominated the great piazza. Carrassi was keen to welcome pilgrims as they entered the city from the north, and so he desired artworks that represented the great counter-Reformation themes of conversion and martyrdom, serving as propaganda against the twin threats of backsliding and Protestantism. The conversion of St. Paul on the road to Damascus, completed in 1601 for the Serassi Chapel of the Church of Santa Maria del Popolo in Rome. This painting depicts the moment recounted in chapter 9 of Acts of the Apostles, when Saul, soon to be the Apostle Paul, fell on the road to Damascus. According to the account, Paul, before his conversion, was a zealous Pharisee who took part in persecuting the followers of Jesus, even participating in the stoning of Stephen. One day, on his famed journey to Damascus, he heard the Lord say, "I am Jesus, whom you persecute. Arise and go into the city." After his conversion, Paul became an apostle who taught the gospel of Christ across the world, founded several churches in Asia Minor and Europe. Paul used his status as both a Jew and a Roman citizen to advantage in his ministry to both Jewish and Roman audiences. Caravaggio's first version of the subject of this painting is in the collection of Principe Guido Odescalchi and was completed in the previous year, displaying a much brighter and more Mannerist-style canvas with an angel-sustained Jesus reaching downwards towards a blinded Paul. In the second rendering of the conversion of St. Paul, Caravaggio focuses on St. Paul's internal involvement with this moment of religious ecstasy by creating a dark and mysterious background. Although the viewer does not see a heavenly apparition, the scene can be easily identified as St. Paul's conversion because of the emotions, intensified by the lighting, experienced by the apostle. St. Paul is portrayed lying on the ground and appears to emit light from himself. As Paul is lying down, he is much smaller than the horse, which is also at the center of the painting. The apostle's body is foreshortened and is not facing the viewer, yet his presence is felt due to artists' masterful handling of the foreshortening as the body looms into the foreground. At the time of the painting's composition, Caravaggio was in competition with Annibale Carracci, who was a painting and altarpiece in the same chapel. Amusingly, Caravaggio gives the back end of the horse a prominent place in the conversion of St. Paul, as it seems to project out of the left side of the image, directly aimed at Carracci's Assumption of the Virgin Mary, which was, and still remains today, immediately beside it. Caravaggio had left Del Monte's household, but remained under his protection when faced with harassment from the law in 1601, taking up new residence with the powerful Mattei family. He lived in the palace of Girolamo Cardinal Mattei, for whom he painted a number of pictures including The Supper at Emmaus, 1601, and The Taking of Christ, 1602, in which he painted himself as a witness. Also, around this period, he painted what was to become, perhaps, his most famous single canvas, with at least 22 copies painted during the 17th century, The Incredulity of St. Thomas, or Doubting Thomas, as it has become known. The Supper at Emmaus, originally commissioned and paid for by Ciriaco Mattei, the brother of Cardinal Girolamo Mattei. The supper at Emmaus depicts the moment when the resurrected Christ suddenly appears to his two disciples, Luke and Cleopas, in the town of Emmaus, shortly before vanishing from their sight, as told in the Gospel of Luke 24:30-31. In this 1602 painting, Caravaggio depicts Cleopas as wearing the scallop shell of a pilgrim, whilst the other disciple wears torn clothes. The artist uses foreshortening to great effect with Cleopas's arm and hand, as they appear to point directly out of the painting, while the disciple gestures and speaks to Christ. The standing groom, with a smooth forehead and face in shadow, appears oblivious to the event. The table displays out a still-life meal, with Caravaggio's meticulous eye for detail being demonstrated once again. Playfully, a basket of food teeters over the edge, adding to the atmosphere of surprise felt by the apostles. Caravaggio painted a later version of the same subject in 1606, in which the gestures of the figures are far more restrained, making the presence of Christ more important than the performance. This difference possibly reflects the circumstances of Caravaggio's life at that point, when he had fled Rome as an outlaw following the murder of Ranuccio Tommasoni. Therefore, in the intervening 5 years between the two versions of the supper at Emmaus, Caravaggio had come to recognize the value of understatement in the composition of his works. The Incredulity of St. Thomas. The Incredulity of St. Thomas is one of the most copied and reproduced of all Caravaggio paintings. According to the Gospel of St. John, Thomas, one of the 12 apostles, had missed Christ's appearance after the resurrection and insisted that, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe it." 1 week later, Christ appeared to Thomas, instructing him, "Reach hither thy hand, and thrust it into my side, and be not faithless, but believing." Thomas was thus convinced about the resurrection, and proclaimed, "My Lord and my God," to which Jesus responded, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." In Caravaggio's composition, light streams into the image from the left side of the frame, bathing Jesus in a warm glow. He and the apostles are tightly arranged, with Jesus and Thomas occupying the forefront. Caravaggio's painstaking attention to veristic, a realistic style in Roman portraiture detail, is most evident in the torn seam on the left shoulder of Thomas's shirt, on the marks on Jesus's torso, and in Thomas's dirty fingernails. Moreover, While the incredulity of St. Thomas was a popular subject in Renaissance and Baroque art, Caravaggio's gruesome focus on Thomas's finger-probing Christ's gaping wound distinguished the work from all others on the same theme. In his analysis of the painting, art historian Gombrich writes, "One can imagine that such a painting struck devout people as being irreverent and even outrageous. They were accustomed to seeing the apostles as dignified figures draped in beautiful folds. Here they looked like common laborers, with weathered faces and wrinkled brows. But," Caravaggio would have answered, "they were old laborers, common people." Gombrich adds that Caravaggio's painting placed him in the company of such greats as Giotto and Dürer before him, since, like them, he had wanted to see the holy events before his own eyes, as if they were happening in a neighbor's house. Despite the belief that Caravaggio always worked with live models, the English artist David Hockney caused controversy when he argued that Caravaggio must have traced using a camera obscura for the painting because none of the figures seemed to be looking directly at the wound on Christ's body. Amma Victorious. The 1602 canvas Amma Victorious portrays Amor, the Roman god of love, wearing dark eagle wings, half sitting on or climbing down from what appears to be a table. Scattered around the composition are the emblems of all human endeavors: violin and lute, armor, coronet, square and compasses, pen and manuscript, bay leaves, and flower, tangled and trampled under Cupid's foot. The painting illustrates the line from Virgil's Eclogues X.69, Omnia vincit amor et nos sedamus amori, love conquers all, let us all yield to love. A musical manuscript on the floor shows a large V. It has been suggested that the picture makes a coded reference to the attainments of Marchese Vincenzo Giustiniani, whose Genoese family ruled Chios until the island's capture by the Turks in 1622, hence the Cupid's coronet. The cultivated Marchese also wrote about music and painting, as identified by the pen, manuscript, and musical instruments, was constructing an imposing new palazzo, geometrical instruments, studied astronomy, astral sphere, and was praised for his military prowess, depicted by the armor. Therefore, the painting seems to suggest Vincenzo conquers all. Giustiniani is said to have prized Amma Victorious above all other works in his collection. Although the subject was common for the age, Caravaggio's treatment is remarkable for the realism of his depiction of Cupid. Where other depictions, such as a contemporary Sleeping Cupid by Battistello Caracciolo, depict an idealized boy, Caravaggio's Cupid is highly individual and not perfectly beautiful. For example, he has crooked teeth, and he appears more like a child you would meet in the street rather than in a divine setting. Caravaggio's work is a masterclass in ultra-realistic delineation of the young male body, replicated with an almost photographic clarity. The image is enhanced with the artist's telltale use of chiaroscuro lighting, as light floods in from the right, illuminating the youth's body and the folds of the white garment behind him to great dramatic effect. The Cupid's left leg is bent back, as though he has just awoken and is about to stand up, giving a playful and more youthful appearance to his posture. Art historians have identified an undeniable resemblance to the earlier pose of Michelangelo's sculpture Victory, which is likely to have inspired Caravaggio in his composition. The painter Orazio Gentileschi lent Caravaggio the wings as props to be used in the painting, providing the precise dating of 1602 for the work. It was an immediate success in the circles of Rome's intellectual and cultural elite. A popular poet immediately wrote 3 madrigals about the piece, and another poet wrote a Latin epigram in which it was first coupled with the Virgilian phrase, omnia vincit amor. Although this did not become its title until the critic Giovanni Pietro Bellori wrote his Life of Caravaggio in 1672. Shortly after the painting was completed, Cardinal Benedetto Giustiniani, Vincenzo's brother and collaborator in the creation of the Giustiniani collection of contemporary art, commissioned a painting from the noted artist Giovanni Baglione. Baglione's divine and profane love depicted divine love separating a juvenile Cupid on the ground in the lower right corner, profane love, from a Lucifer in the left corner. Its style was very similar to Caravaggio's Amor Victorious, and he bitterly protested at what he saw as plagiarism. Taunted by one of Caravaggio's friends, Baglione responded with a second version, in which the devil was given Caravaggio's face. Thus commenced a long and vicious quarrel, which would have unforeseeable consequences for Caravaggio's reputation decades after his death, when the unforgiving Baglione became his first biographer. Commenting on this painting and what it tells us about Caravaggio's sexuality, art critic Jonathan Jones notes that it was plainly and painted from life, which meant a youth has stood naked in Caravaggio's studio wearing fake wings. He describes how Cupid grins cockily as he displays his flesh, in a light that somehow leads all eyes directly to, well, the penis, and it is overt sexuality, not romantic notion of love, that triumphs in this painting. Jones explains that, in its day, the painting was seen by many as a personal confession that proved Caravaggio guilty of the crime they called sodomy, which in Caravaggio's case, outside of marriage, plainly meant homosexuality. Indeed, while contemporary critics like Jones see Caravaggio's homosexuality at the heart of his genius, and paintings such as Amor Vincit Omnia as acts of defiance in an age when the wrong kind of love could get you executed, Jones argues, in fact, that Caravaggio took the noble image of love for male beauty proclaimed by Michelangelo and made it dirty, trashy, dangerous. Amor Vincit Omnia had certainly upset many of Caravaggio's generation. Chief amongst his critics was the late Mannerist, our early Baroque painter, Giovanni Baglione. For Baglione, Amor Vincit Omnia simply confirmed the rumor that Caravaggio and Cecco Boneri, his male assistant, were lovers. Baglione produced Divine Love, Conquering Earthly Love, 1602-03. A parody of Caravaggio's Amor Vincit Omnia, in which he depicted Caravaggio as the devil contriving to sodomize a Cupid, with the central figure of the angel stepping in to prevent the devil from doing so. Caravaggio responded with a wave of satirical verse ridiculing Baglione and his paintings. In the summer of 1603, Caravaggio was imprisoned on charges of libel, brought against him by Baglione. Probably with pressure from Del Monte, Caravaggio was released from prison in the fall of 1603 with all charges dropped. Caravaggio quickly recovered from this setback when in early 1604 he commenced work on the large altarpiece, the Madonna of Loreto, or Pilgrim's Madonna, for the Cavalletti Chapel of the Church of Sant'Agostino in Rome. That project was completed to great popular acclaim between 1604–05. John the Baptist, Saint John the Baptist, the cousin of Jesus Christ, was the subject of at least 8 paintings by Caravaggio. For the 1602 John the Baptist, now housed in the Capitoline Museum in Rome, the same model was used as for the previous painting, Amor Victorious. Cecco, Caravaggio's servant and possibly his pupil as well, has been tentatively identified as an artist active in Rome about 1610–1625, otherwise known only as Cecco del Caravaggio, who painted very much in Caravaggio's style. The most striking feature of Amor was the young model's evident glee in posing for the painting, so that it became rather more a portrait of Cecco than a depiction of a Roman god. The same sense of the real-life model overwhelming the supposed subject can also be detected in his posing as John the Baptist. The youthful John is portrayed half-reclining, one arm around a ram's neck, his head turned to the viewer with an impish grin. There is very little to signify that this is indeed the prophet. No customary cross, nor leather belt. Just a scrap of camel's skin lost in the voluminous folds of the red cloak and a rustic-appearing ram, which is also unconventional, as John the Baptist's animal was traditionally the lamb, marking his greeting of Christ as the Lamb of God come to take away the sins of mankind. The ram was often employed in art as a symbol of lust, implying a sacrifice to desire. Interestingly, the pose adopted by the model is a clear imitation of the posture adopted by one of Michelangelo's famous ignudi on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, painted 1508–1512, once again underlining Caravaggio's devotion to that artist. The role of these gigantic male nudes in Michelangelo's depiction of the world before the laws of Moses has always been unclear, with some art historians believing them to be angels, while others argue that they represent the Neoplatonic ideal of human beauty. But for Caravaggio to pose his adolescent assistant as one of the master's dignified witnesses to the creation was clearly a means of paying a humorous compliment to one of his greatest inspirations. The composition proved immensely popular, with 11 known copies being made, including one, now housed in the Doria Pamphilj Gallery in Rome, recognized by scholars as being by Caravaggio's own hand. The entombment deposition, described by the Vatican Museum, which is now home to the painting, as one of Caravaggio's greatest masterpieces. The entombment was commissioned by Girolamo Vitrice for his family chapel in Santa Maria in Vallicella, Chiesa Nuova, in Rome. The scene shows mourners carrying Christ's body to its burial place, with John the Evangelist in a red cloak supporting Christ's torso, and Nicodemus carrying Christ's legs. A distraught Mary of Clopas, a weeping Mary Magdalene, and a bowed Virgin Mary accompany Christ to his burial. As in his other work, the figures are presented with a realism that belies their religious significance, and this is enhanced by the red and brown tones of the image, representative of Caravaggio's palette in this period, which further serve to highlight the earthy normality of the participants. It is plausible that the composition was inspired by Michelangelo's 15th-century Pieta in St. Peter's Basilica, as Christ's limp body, dangling arm, and foreshortened chest and head echo the pose of Christ as seen from the front of the sculpture. It is a revolutionary work for Caravaggio's time, detailing a highly naturalistic reconstruction of a gospel event, which even Caravaggio's great enemy Baglioni admired. The entombment of Christ presents a diagonal cascade of mourners and cadaver bearers, descending to the dead Christ and the bare stone in a scene of somber mourning. The misery felt by the grieving Mary Magdalene is effectively conveyed by the posture of her upraised arms and the pained expression on her face. The painting is organized along a dramatic diagonal, with figures aligned in a descent from the top right of the picture to the lower left corner. Each person illustrates a progression of emotion commensurate with their position in the painting. The outstretched arms and extended palms of Mary of Clopas occupies the apex of the diagonal and suggests the initial reaction of disbelief and despair at Christ's execution. The composition then proceeds downwards to a weeping Mary Magdalene, her face concealed from the viewer, to the resigned bowed head of the Virgin Mary, to Nicodemus struggling under Christ's weight. He turns his face to the viewer as if to ask, "What next?" The question is answered by John the Evangelist, who focuses on the example of Christ himself, whose expression of serenity, peace, and acceptance of death completes the painting's emotional arc. Tradition usually dictated that the Virgin Mary should be depicted as eternally young, but here Caravaggio paints the Virgin as an old woman. The figure of the Virgin Mary is also partially obscured. We see her in the black robe and her arms are held out to her side, imitating the line of the stone they stand upon. Her right hand hovers above Christ's head as if she's reaching out to touch her son. To emphasize the dead Christ's inability to feel pain, a hand from one of his bearers enters the wound at his side. His body is one of a muscled, veined, thick-limbed laborer, rather than the usual bony-thin depiction. The painting was designed to hang above an altar, and the stone tomb in the image echoes the shape and appearance of the altar. Consequently, Caravaggio extended the scene of burial into the space of the worshippers, and the frontal light source beyond the plane of the painting appeared to emanate from the altar itself, a divine light of resurrection animating and lending hope to the burial scene above. Graham Dixon tells us that in the early 1400s, Rome had become home to some 2,000 artists who gathered together in distinct communities, according to their place of origin, and that daily violence and/or vendettas between different groups was commonplace. Court records during this period indicate that Caravaggio was involved in myriad scrapes and mishaps of a violent nature, including throwing stones, carrying a sword and dagger in public, defacing a property in an act of revenge against a previous insult, known as deturpatio, and inflicting grievous bodily harm. In one of the more colorful episodes, dated April 24, 1604, Caravaggio started a brawl with a waiter regarding his order of 8 cooked artichokes, in which the artist smashed the man's face with a plate. He was only protected from prosecution, as he usually was, because witnesses were reluctant to confirm the artist's involvement in such misdemeanors for fear of reprisal from his influential and prominent patrons. Between late 1605–06, Caravaggio painted an altarpiece, the Madonna of the Palafrenieri, the Madonna of the Serpent, for the chapel of the Papal Grooms in St. Peter's. It was hastily removed from public view, however, due to rumors that Caravaggio had modeled his Virgin, whom he endowed with a full bosom, on the prostitute Melandroni. He followed this with what was his last important Roman commission, the Death of the Virgin, 1604–06, for the Santa Maria della Scala. But it too was quickly removed from public view because Caravaggio had represented Mary and the Apostles as refugees. Caravaggio's volatile temperament finally caught up with him on May 28, 1606, when he killed the hustler and pimp Ranuccio Tomassoni in an illegal duel that took place on the tennis court of the French ambassador to Rome. Tomassoni was under Melandroni's control while she was modeling for Caravaggio, and this undoubtedly caused considerable friction between them. Graham Dixon tells us that the two men were probably dueling over the affections of Melandroni or perhaps Tomassoni's wife. In either case, writes Graham Dixon, Caravaggio pierced his opponent's femoral artery with his dueling sword, causing him to bleed to death in a very short time. The nature of the injury, close to Tomassoni's groin, may suggest that Caravaggio intended to wound his opponent sexually. Wounds were meaningful in the honor culture of the time. So, for example, a facial wound might be inflicted to avenge an insult to reputation or loss of face, while a genital wounding or attempted castration might mark a dispute over a woman. Caravaggio fled Rome before formal charges of murder were brought against him. He was sentenced in absentia to indefinite exile from the city, condemned as a murderer, and subject to a capital sentence, bando capitale, which allowed anyone in the Papal States to receive a monetary reward for killing him. In the absence of his body, the presentation of Caravaggio's severed head would suffice for the bounty hunter to claim their prize. Having fled Rome, the newly convicted murderer and fugitive Caravaggio first took refuge in the Alban Hills in the Colonna territories, about 20 kilometers southeast of Rome. David with the head of Goliath was produced around this time for the papal nephew and admirer of Caravaggio's art, Scipione Borghese, in the hope it might be offered as part of a plea bargain to have his sentence rescinded. If that was Caravaggio's plan, it did not work. It is believed that for this work, Caravaggio cast his assistant and probable lover, Boneri, as David, and himself in the role of Goliath. However, the Borghese Gallery states that more recently it has been hypothesized by scholars that it might be a picture of the painter rejuvenated, which makes this painting a double self-portrait. David with the head of Goliath, completed by 1610, this important painting is housed in the Galleria Borghese in Rome, and originally formed part of the collection of Cardinal Scipione Borghese. In the composition of the piece, it is believed Caravaggio was inspired by a painting produced by a follower of Giorgione, though he dramatizes the moment to a greater extent by portraying Goliath's head dangling from David's hand with blood dripping down to the bottom of the canvas, instead of a more static image of the head resting on a ledge. The sword in David's hand carries the inscription HSOS, which has been interpreted as an abbreviation of the Latin phrase humilitas occidit superbiam. Humility kills pride. David is depicted bearing a pensive, somewhat troubled expression as he looks upon the bloody mess of his defeated foe, a posture at variance with the usual heroic and jubilant portrayals of the biblical hero. An unusual bond is formed between the gloomy victor and his victim, as David contemplates the act he has committed. The canvas is given further poignancy by the fact that Caravaggio has depicted his own head as Goliath's, while the model for David was most likely Cecco del Caravaggio, the artist's studio assistant in Rome some years previously, and who had at one time been recorded as the boy who lay with him. Nevertheless, no independent portraits of Cecco are known, making the identification impossible to verify, though some art historians argue that sexual intimacy between Caravaggio and Cecco was likely. Others go on to claim that this image was produced as a demonstration of Caravaggio's remorse for his treatment of the youth, though, of course, such arguments are always tentative theories at best. Still, there is an even more significant interpretation often ascribed to this canvas. On 29 May 1606, Caravaggio had killed, possibly unintentionally, a young man named Ranuccio Tomassoni from Terni. From that time on, the artist had wandered in exile, having fled from the anger of the Pope, spending time in Naples and Malta, as well as other cities. But still, Caravaggio hungered to return to Rome and receive forgiveness for the killing of Tomassoni. It is widely believed that this painting was intended for Caravaggio's patron, the Cardinal Scipione Borghese, nephew of the Pope, who had the power to grant or withhold pardons. In portraying himself as the slain Goliath, Caravaggio provides the image of himself as a punished victim, who now can ask for mercy, hoping that a literal sacrifice of himself will not be necessary, since he has provided a humble and very well executed demonstration of his guilt and remorse. David's look of sadness can then be seen as to encourage the cardinal to be lenient in his treatment of the artist. Caravaggio soon headed south, arriving in the Spanish-controlled Naples in September 1606, where he enjoyed the protection of the powerful condottiero, leader of mercenaries, Fabrizio Sforza Colonna. In the 9 months he spent in the city, as a guest at the papal Colonna residence, he produced 4 altarpieces: the 7 Acts of Mercy, Flagellation of Christ, Crucifixion of Saint Andrew, and the Madonna of the Rosary, although the latter, which is noticeably more melodramatic than the others, was probably painted while he was still in Rome and taken with him when he fled. From Naples, Caravaggio traveled on to Malta. His plan, probably put to him by his host and long-term friend Costanza Colonna, daughter of Fabrizio, was to enlist in the religious military order, the Knights of the Order of St. John, or the Hospitallers, as they were commonly known. As a member of the order, Caravaggio would qualify for an automatic pardon in Rome. Caravaggio painted a number of pictures in honor of the order and its elders, such as portrait of Fra Antonio Martelli, 1608, and the portrait of Alof de Wignacourt and his page, 1607-08. Wignacourt was the order's Grand Master, and was so pleased with his portrait, he personally petitioned the Pope for Caravaggio to be granted the status of Knight of Obedience of the Order of St. John. Permission was granted, and Caravaggio set about working on the largest of all his paintings, the Beheading of St. John, 1608, for the oratory of the conventual church of Valletta. It was a symbolic painting that warned would-be occupiers of their fate should they try to enter Malta. It secured Caravaggio his pardon, and he was once more a free man, if only temporarily. The Beheading of St. John the Baptist. This is Caravaggio's largest work, and was painted as an altarpiece for the oratory of San Giovanni Decollato, annexed to the Church of St. John in Valletta, in Malta. It is widely seen as one of Caravaggio's greatest paintings, and was his passaggio, a gift customarily given following investiture into the Order of the Knights of Malta. This work is notable as the only piece Caravaggio ever signed. The blood pouring from John's head oozes into the artist's centrally positioned signature, which reads as Fra Michelangelo, which, according to art historian Keith Cyberas, denotes the artist's new social status as Michelangelo, Knight of Malta. Scholars, including art historian Hervarth Roetgen, have understood Caravaggio's blood signature as an act of contrition, the artist professing his guilt and admitting his hand in the murder of a rival, the event which precipitated his flight and exile from Rome. Alternatively, art historian David M. Stone argues that the artist's decision to sign the work through St. John's blood should be read as a celebratory gesture, the artist marking his new life in Malta as a knight and his subsequent newly elevated social status. As with other works from his Maltese period, the figures are clustered together, leaving large swathes of empty or less populated space above and adjacent to the focus of the action. As a consequence, although the artist imbues each actor with a unique emotional response, individuality is subsumed to the collective illustration of the dramatic moment. The only figure who betrays a strong emotion in the image is the old woman. The artist's tenebrism relegates much of her face to shadow, but Caravaggio highlights her hands, grasping her head in horror. The old woman is the emotional corollary to the deceased St. John, and to the still calm of the other witnesses. The old woman's head, clasped in shock and dismay between her hands, represents the viewer's emotional entry into the scene. The painting typifies Caravaggio's signature chiaroscuro technique, which the 17th century biographer Giovanni Pietro Bellori described thus: "He went so far in this style that he never showed any of his figures in open daylight, but instead found a way to place them in the darkness of a closed room, placing a lamp high so that the light would fall straight down, revealing the principal part of the body and leaving the rest in shadow." On the eve of the painting's unveiling, Caravaggio's demons possessed him once again, and he became involved in a fracas in which he shot and wounded a senior knight of justice. Caravaggio was thrown into jail for the offense. With the aid of an accomplice, Caravaggio escaped via an awaiting boat. In late October 1608, he arrived in Syracuse, Sicily, now a wanted man in Rome and Malta. On December 1st, 1608, an effigy of Caravaggio was ceremoniously defrocked beneath the beheading of St. John, and he was declared to have been expelled and thrust forth like a rotten and diseased limb from our order and society. Despite his not inconsiderable woes, Caravaggio still found the time to paint. He produced a large altarpiece of the Burial of St. Lucy, 1608-09, for the Basilica di Santa Lucia al Sepolcro in Syracuse, and two other works, Adoration of the Shepherds, 1609, for the Church of Santa Maria degli Angeli in Messina, and Resurrection of Lazarus, so 1609, for the Church of the Padri Crociferi, also in Messina. By the fall of 1609, Caravaggio was back in Naples, once more a guest at the Colonna Palace. He painted an altarpiece, The Raising of Lazarus, for the Church of Sant'Anna dei Lombardi, although the building and its treasures were later lost in an earthquake. His past soon caught up with him, however, and Caravaggio was attacked by 4 men, thought to have traveled from Malta outside a tavern. He received serious facial and head wounds, suggesting it was a symbolic revenge attack, and was close to death for several months. Caravaggio painted his last 2 works in 1610, The Denial of Peter and the Martyrdom of Saint Ursula. In these, the shaky handling of the paint suggests that he was suffering from hand tremors and/or problems with his vision. With the backing of Costanza Colonna, Caravaggio renegotiated his pardon, and in July 1610 he set off for Rome via the port of Palo. With several paintings he would present to Borghese in exchange for granting his reprieve. He was, however, arrested and detained at Palo, although it is not known on what charge. His paintings, however, continued on their journey to Porto Ercole, a small harbour town in Tuscany. Caravaggio, having bought his freedom, rode to Porto Ercole. It was just a day's ride, but the midsummer sun and his poor physical state caused him to collapse. He died soon after arriving, probably on July 18th or 19th, at the age of 38. He was buried in an unmarked grave. The Martyrdom of Saint Ursula. This 1610 painting is now thought to be Caravaggio's last canvas and is currently part of the Intesa San Paolo collection in the gallery of Palazzo Zevallos Stigliano, Naples. It concerns Saint Ursula, who was accompanied by 11,000 virgins and captured by the Huns. Legend tells that 11,000 virgins were slaughtered, but the king of the Huns was overcome by Ursula's modesty and beauty and begged her forgiveness if only she would marry him. Ursula replied that she would not, upon which the king shot her with an arrow. Caravaggio painted the martyrdom of Saint Ursula in Naples for Marcantonio Doria, a young nobleman from Genoa. Doria had become an ardent collector of Caravaggio's work, and he commissioned the painting to mark the entry of his stepdaughter into a religious order as Sister Ursula. The date of the painting can be identified as shortly before 11th May 1610, when Doria's procurator in Naples, Lanfranco Massa, wrote to his master that the painting was finished. There had been a slight accident, the agent wrote, when he had tried to hasten the drying by leaving it out in the sun the day before, softening the varnish. The agent told Doria not to worry, as he would take it back to Caravaggio to be repaired. He then went on to urge Doria to commission more works from the artist, as people are fighting over him, and this is a good chance. The canvas was received in Genoa on 18th of June, and Doria was delighted, placing it alongside his other works by Raphael and Leonardo. Caravaggio had arrived in Naples from Sicily in September or October 1609. Within days, he was attacked outside a restaurant by 4 armed men, leading to rumors that he had been killed or facially disfigured. It is probable that he required a long time to convalesce, and it is difficult to connect more than a handful of works, and most of them tentatively, to his second stay in Naples. The martyrdom of Saint Ursula, however, can be positively identified as being the work of Caravaggio and marks yet another change in his style. In Sicily, he had continued the compositional scheme introduced with the beheading of Saint John the Baptist, a small group of figures dwarfed by massive architecture. But Ursula marks a return to a scene which brings the narrative directly into the space of the viewer, at the very moment when the Hun king lets fly his arrow, as Ursula looks down with an expression of mild surprise at the shaft sticking out of her chest. To the right and rear, a few witnesses stare in shock. One of them, the upturned face behind Ursula, is believed to be a self-portrait of Caravaggio. In July, Caravaggio set off by boat to receive a pardon from the Pope for his part in the death of a young man in a duel in 1606. But instead of receiving the pardon, he died at Porto Ercole, on the coast north of Rome, in mysterious circumstances, although a fever is most often given as the cause of death. Caravaggio has been alternately identified as an exemplar of late Mannerist style, or as a harbinger of the Baroque era. Though only 21 works have been definitively attributed to the artist, Caravaggio was a formidable artistic influence both in his time and today. By 1605, other Roman artists were beginning to imitate his signature style, and shortly thereafter, artists outside of Italy, such as Rembrandt and Diego Velázquez, were incorporating Caravaggio's dramatic lighting effects into their own landmark works. Caravaggio's paintings also inspired important poets of his time, such as Cavalier Giambattista Marino. But despite acclaim in his lifetime and immediately after by the 18th century, Caravaggio's legacy was all but forgotten. Aside from some interest by neoclassical painters such as Jacques-Louis David, the modern and contemporary fascination with the artist is largely due to the efforts of Italian art historian Roberto Longhi, whose 1951 Milanese exhibition and his 1952 Caravaggio monograph returned the artist to the public eye and cemented his current status. Beyond compositional innovations, Caravaggio's legacy has also been connected to the ostensibly queer content of his paintings, a signifier of his own potential homosexuality. The interpretation of Caravaggio's androgynous, sensual, and partly dressed or naked young men through the lens of homosexual desire is a contested issue within Caravaggio scholarship. Some authors, such as Donald Posner and Graham L. Hamill, unequivocally declare that works such as these represent depictions of queer sensuality and seduction. Others, such as Creighton Gilbert and David Carrier, note that current assessments of the homoerotic content in the artist's work misattribute to the 16th and 17th centuries the codes of 20th century ideas about queerness and image signification. That complaint notwithstanding, filmmakers such as Pier Paolo Pasolini and Derek Jarman have helped secure the artist his place in the queer pantheon. The lauded gay Italian Marxist Pasolini, a one-time student of Longhi, created the multi-award-winning film The Gospel, according to St. Matthew in 1964 as a clear homage to Caravaggio, while Jarman, a leading figure within the new queer cinema movement, recreated the passionate imagery of Caravaggio's art and used the artist's life story to explore his own preoccupations with history, homosexuality, violence, and the connection between painting and film in his 1986 biopic, Caravaggio.